Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Maartje.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're talking about The Bridge on the River Kwai, which came out in 1957. It was directed by David Lean, written by Carl Foreman and Michael Wilson. It's based on the 1952 novel of the same name, written in French, of course, by Pierre Boulle, and it's won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. And the movie is about 60,000 Allied POWs who constructed the Burma Railway for the Japanese, linking the Bay of Bengal on the coast of what is today Myanmar to Bangkok and Singapore in 1942 and 1943. And this story follows a group of them as they build a key bridge over the River Kwai. What did you think of this movie?
I enjoyed this movie quite a bit. I thought it was quite long. It's like another one of those classics that takes forever. I want to say the first 40 minutes are a bit slow, but then it picks up and it gets quite exciting. I enjoyed recognizing the famous theme from the movie. The acting was decent. Yeah, I thought it was okay. Bit one-sided maybe, but okay. How about you?
Well, as you know, I read the book first, and the movie is so much better than the book that the whole time I was watching it, I was just like, yeah, this is great. No, I agree with you. It is long. You'll watch it and you'll be like, yeah, you can tell that it was made in 1957, but I did enjoy myself. It's kind of an adventure movie. They made a lot of choices when they adapted it into a movie that I thought were great choices character-wise. And yeah, I enjoyed the movie, not so much the book.
I'm sorry you had to go through the book, but maybe can you explain why the book is so terrible?
Sure, yeah. So it's a short read and it's not a difficult read. That's probably the best thing that I can say about it. The guy who wrote it is just staggeringly racist, but in a very old-fashioned 19th century Rudyard Kipling sort of way. The entire book, literally anything that a Japanese person does or like a Thai person does or anything, he finds a reason to talk about, well, of course they didn't know this because they didn't have the advantage of Western foresight. And so he just so often talks about how, well, the Japanese were terrible at this, but of course they were because they're not Westerners and they don't know anything. And he uses a lot of questionable language that we wouldn't use today. And I got to the halfway point of the book and I was like, come on, man, like just tell the story. So I liked the movie because it left all of that out.
Yeah, I don't quite know what the benefit is of having to like mansplain in the worst possible way why certain things are happening in certain ways. You sent me some excerpts of it, and you're right, the language is just cringeworthy. It just made me like physically uncomfortable reading it, so I feel like even for the time that was particularly racist.
Yeah, I would think that even in the 50s, people would have found it tone deaf. That's how bad it is.
Yeah. So we do not recommend the book, is what you're saying.
No, but you know what the wild thing is? This is the same guy who wrote Planet of the Apes. So he had 2 books that became like quite successful, well-known movies. But I gotta think that, you know, like I said, in the screenplay for this movie, they made a lot of choices character-wise that are much different than the book that helps flesh characters out and explains why they do what they do and that kind of thing. And I'm like, there's none of that like depth in the original book.
Well, thank you for going through that so I don't have to, and none of our readers have to. I appreciate it very much. Let's get into the movie. The movie opens with a group of Allied POWs being forced to work on a railway line in the jungle in Siam, in Thailand, by the Japanese in 1943. We focus on 2 POWs in America called Shears, played by William Holden, who we also saw in Stalag 17, I believe. Is that the right movie?
Yep, that's him.
And Australian called Weaver, who we have no idea who plays this man because he's nowhere to be found. Not in the credits, not in Internet Movie Database, not anywhere on Reddit, so we've got no clue who this man is. But they've just finished burying what remained of their little group of prisoners. The work is so brutally difficult and the men are so susceptible to disease in the jungle that Shears and Weaver are the only 2 survivors of the group.
Yeah, so this is the beginning of choices they made in the movie that I thought improved on the book. In the book, Shears is not a POW. There's two plot lines going on concurrently. So we have our group of POWs and the one subplot, and then the other subplot is Shears and his little group of amigos are commandos and they're operating in the jungle. So they're completely separate from the POWs, like they don't interact.
Wow, that's a choice.
Yeah, I thought it was much better to have them interact with the other POWs in the movie because that way you're actually like, you get to learn about the characters and you're actually interested in them.
Right, and you have a centralized starting point a little bit. I think that's a better choice, at least movie-wise, because otherwise it's going to get so confusing for the viewers, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also feel like, William Holden's just pretty charming. Like I don't know that this is like the role of a lifetime or anything, but he plays the character in a way that gives some depth and some interest. So, it's nice to see him in this movie.
He's pretty pessimistic as a character too.
For sure, yeah.
Again, a pessimistic character. I wonder if that's like a trait of his.
Yeah, that's true, because he was kind of the guy in Stalag 17 who was like kind of a jerk to everyone else. That moment when they're burying all of their buddies, a new group of British prisoners enters the camp led by Colonel Nicholson, played by Alec Guinness. Colonel Saito, played by Sesue Hayakawa, he's the camp commandant. He greets the new prisoners by informing them that they'll be working on building a bridge to join two sections of the railway line. And he also declares that all men will work, including the officers. Nicholson reminds him of the Hague Convention about officers working. Basically, in a POW camp, traditionally, if you're following the correct conventions, the officers don't work. Like they'll obviously still be in charge of the men and still be supervising them, but they don't do manual labor. So that's a huge point of contention for Nicholson and Saito. And as the men march in, they're whistling a song, which is called the Colonel Bogey March. It's a British march that was composed in 1914 by Lieutenant F.J. Ricketts. And during the Second World War, British soldiers sang the lyrics, "Hitler has only got one ball," to accompany the tune. And if people are not familiar, it's a funny little song. The lyrics are, "Hitler has only got one ball. Goering has two, but very small. Himmler is rather similar, but poor old Goebbels has no balls at all." And apparently the song in the movie was originally supposed to be sung, but the widow of Lieutenant Ricketts, who wrote it, she protested at the inappropriate lyrics, because obviously when he wrote it, it didn't have those words. And so they whistled it instead, but they knew that the audience would pick up on what the song was, what the lyrics were.
I thought this was really funny. The music, too, in this movie is quite interesting, especially toward the end. But we'll get there when we get to the end. It just made me laugh.
Yeah, absolutely.
We meet Major Clifton, played by James Donald, who is the medical officer. And together with Nicholson, he meets Shears. And Shears informs them of the bad conditions in the camp. And the officers have a meeting that night in which Nicholson tells the others that they won't have an escape committee because they were ordered to surrender by headquarters. And anyway, the jungle is virtually impassable, which was true. And I thought it was interesting because they surrendered. He says something about if they escape while they officially surrendered, they wouldn't be protected at all.
Yeah. Nicholson's an interesting character. In the book, what happens is that they're at, I want to say, like the fall of Singapore, which was a massive, massive British defeat in World War II. And they never, they didn't go down fighting or anything. They literally got the directive from on high that you guys are going to surrender. And a whole bunch of the guys were like, well, we'll just fuck off into the jungle and they won't get us. And Nicholson was like, no, we were ordered to surrender. We're going to stay here. We're all going to surrender. Yeah. This guy's very by the book.
Yeah, he's a stickler for the rules for sure.
Yeah. Shears, when he's talking about Nicholson and his behavior and his decisions, he references both the charge of the Light Brigade. He says, "Into the Valley of Death rode the 600, and British officers going over the top in World War I to sort of call into question the wiseness of Nicholson's strict adherence to the law. He ends up being sort of a reluctant hero in this movie, and it's a contrast to Nicholson. And I thought that was actually a really smart addition by the writers, because in the book, Shears and Nicholson meet only super, super briefly right at the end of the book.
Yeah, I really like both of these characters for very different reasons. Like you say, they're very kind of opposites in terms of character as well. I don't really know anything about the charge of the Light Brigade, but I don't know if you have any information ready for that.
I believe it was in the 19th century. I don't remember what battle it was, but basically
okay.
the British entered into like a battle that they like could not possibly win. And so it became a whole thing where it was like, oh, these guys were such heroes. But everyone was like, but they didn't have to do that though. Like they didn't have to like basically commit suicide by going into this battle that was totally unnecessary.
Right, there was no real point to it, so they, even though people were calling them heroes, it was lost to begin with. So is it really that heroic if you're just basically giving yourself up?
Yeah, it was the Crimean War. That was what I was going to guess. I was like, I wonder if I just... Anyway, yeah, it was in the Crimean War. The charge of the Light Brigade, it was British light cavalry against Russian forces. And yeah, they basically didn't have to do it, didn't have to do this suicidal charge, but they did it anyway.
All right. So I do find it interesting to learn other stuff about other wars as we're going.
If I recall correctly, too, part of the reason why they went on this suicidal charge was obviously back in the day, they didn't have like radio, so they couldn't immediately communicate. So this one guy had orders that didn't make any sense and obviously like probably shouldn't have followed those orders. But he was like, well, haven't heard anything else, so I guess we're doing the thing.
Orders are orders, which is kind of, I guess, what Nicholson is doing.
Yeah.
He's pretty much like, well, these are our orders and this is what we're going to do, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, that makes sense.
And I gather some of the people when this movie was being made and when it came out found it to be anti-British, which I do understand. Nicholson is very like, he's your quintessential British officer. You know, he's gonna follow the rules to the T. He's gonna, you know.
Yeah, and in the end, he's the reason they don't succeed in their mission. So I guess that's not the most popular choice to make for a movie or a book.
Saito, the camp commandant, turns out to be much less reasonable than initially assumed. Nicholson, the next day, he's like, yeah, we're the officers. We're not going to do manual labor. That's not how it's supposed to go. And Saito responds to that by pointing a machine gun at all of the officers. He sends the enlisted men away, and you sort of get the vibe that he's like, well, now there's no witnesses. I'm just gonna kill all these officers who are not doing any work. And they end up being saved by Clipton, the medical guy, who comes running out, and he reminds Saito that all of the men in the hospital wing would be witnesses to this massacre, so he wouldn't get away with it.
Yeah, Clipton almost seems to be kind of the voice of reason within this movie. He's like watching from a distance, but he occasionally says something smart, and he's a little bit of like a conscience to both Nicholson and to Saito, so it's really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
The officers are left to stand in the heat, and they are then confined because Saito decides, okay, maybe I shouldn't shoot them in front of the prisoners. And they are left to stand in the heat, and they are then confined in very cramped boxes called the ovens, which is exactly what you think it is. It's like a box with like metal plating on it, so left out in the sun, you'd be very uncomfortable. Saito then tries to get Clipton to talk some sense into Nicholson, who's in one of those ovens, but he refuses on principle. He's like, nope, I want to be treated the way I should be treated, and so should my man, so I'm just gonna stay in here.
Yeah, in the book, his character is so rigid in this way. He's just like, because in the book, I don't believe the officers are also confined. I think it's just him. And all of the men and all the officers think that he's just like a big hero for standing up for his principles. And I'm like, okay.
At least in a movie, especially in the beginning, you do kind of want to root for him because he seems friendly and to care for his men and all that. But it's also like, if you're gonna stick to your principles like that, you are just gonna die, and everybody else is also gonna die. So it's tricky, I guess.
Yeah, and the Japanese made officers work anywhere that they were doing forced labor, so definitely wouldn't have been just this one camp commandant being unreasonable.
Yeah. Is it also, I think it is somewhere around the scene, there's a scene that made me laugh, and if it's coming up later, then I must have missed it in your notes, but they get a present from Saito, which are actually just the Red Cross packages that are due, which made me laugh.
Yeah, it's funny. He's just trying everything, to try and win over these guys. Shears, Weaver, and a young soldier named Jennings attempt to escape from the POW camp. Unfortunately, they get chased down, and only Shears survives. He also gets shot, but he ends up getting rescued by some villagers and eventually makes his way to a British army post and safety.
These villagers kind of treat him like he's some kind of god. I thought this was a choice for sure. Like,
yeah, honestly, they did include some Thai people in this movie, and we'll see them again later. In the book, anytime they reference them, it's very like noble savage. You know, it's like, oh, well, yeah, these guys thought that like we were so great. Us white people were so great. Like they thought we were just amazing. And, you know, they were so helpful despite the fact that they're not white. And like, it's just like, man, it's pretty rough.
The enlisted men begin to work on a bridge, but the Japanese engineer is not particularly qualified or gifted, and the men are also trying to sabotage the job every single chance they get. So, progress is very slow. Saito ultimately allows Nicholson out of the box and his officers not to work, and in turn Nicholson recruits Captain Reeves, played by Peter Williams, an engineer, and Major Hughes, played by John Boxer, a diligent leader and organizer of men, to help him get the project properly underway. Some of the other characters perceive this to be collaborating with the enemy, but Nicholson views the bridge as a reflection on the British Army and won't let progress be slowed any further. This was one of those things where I thought, okay, this is the British showing that they're better than the Japanese in every single way. They have to kind of prove it to the Japanese. Made me cringe.
Yeah. In the book, Nicholson gets out of his little prison and he goes to see the work the men are doing. And the men think that he's going to be like in on it. They're like, look at us. We're screwing up this bridge. And he's so mad. He's like, we're British. We're going to build a proper bridge. We're going to show these heathens how it's done. And in the book, they're like, yeah. And like, all of the British men secretly wanted to do that all along because they're British and they're stand-up types. And they were actually tired of doing sabotage anyway. So they were all a little bit relieved that Nicholson was giving them the order to do it right because they really wanted to do it right. I was like, okay. Major Warden, played by Jack Hawkins. He's part of Force 316. They're planning an attack on the bridge. He's over at the, the British Army post. This is like a separate little subplot. And he recruits Shears, who's just been hanging out now that he's gotten to safety, for his knowledge of the surrounding area on the River Kwai. Shears reveals that he's not actually an officer. The whole time he'd been claiming to be a Navy commander. But yeah, so he reveals he's not an officer. He's super reluctant to participate in this whole game. He has a girlfriend in town who is also uncredited, but she's played by Ann Sears, I guess. And he's not keen on going back to the place that he just escaped from. And I actually read online that the girlfriend was allegedly added after filming began because the studio was mad there weren't any white women in this movie.
I do like her performance though. She's fun.
Yeah, I wasn't mad about it either. The group also recruits Lieutenant Joyce, played by Jeffrey Holm, a young a young Canadian. And Mart has put hot in brackets, a young hot Canadian. Redundant.
Well, yes, he's like the most good-looking man in this movie.
Yeah, he's all right.
So eventually Shears does agree. He kind of gets no choice and he agrees to join them on their mission to sabotage and to blow up the bridge. So Warden, Shears, Joyce, and another guy parachute into the jungle. But the fourth man is killed upon landing. He's kind of hanging from a tree and he's dead. And then they run afoul on a Japanese patrol, and Warden, who's kind of the leader of the gang, is wounded. His foot is terribly bleeding. So he tells the other men to leave him behind, but Shears insists that he be carried, so they don't want to leave him behind.
Yeah, Shears wasn't into Nicholson doing hero shit, and he's not into Warden doing hero shit either. He's like, why would we leave you behind? That doesn't make any sense.
Warden is this kind of older English commander. He's like, no, I'm fine. I can walk. And then he just slows everybody down. And also at this point, they are joined by 4 Thai women and a Thai guide. Oh, that's what you get to write after this. I'm sorry. Ignore me.
So Kun Yai, who's a village chief, played by MRB Chakrabandu, and a group of Thai women guide the commando unit to the river. Shears and Joyce rig the bridge with explosives and they run a wire to a detonator that's hidden with Joyce in the jungle. So what they're waiting for is, as soon as the bridge is complete and is connected with the rest of the railway, the Japanese are planning on sending a train down that's full of like, high-ranking military brass and that kind of stuff. So when the first train crosses, that's when they're going to blow the bridge.
I did really like both the journey through the jungle and the actual rigging of the bridge were quite tense. I quite like this part of the movie. I think it's the best part that we get. So enjoyed that for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
During the night, the river level drops, so the wire that they've kind of laid under the river, underwater, is revealed by the low side of the river. Nicholson, who is patrolling the bridge, spots it, and he leads Saito right to it. I thought this was so strange. I was like, why is he doing this? Is this just pride of not wanting his precious bridge to be blown up? But Joyce, of course, sees this happening. He's like waiting on the riverbank. And he kind of sprints forward and like knives Saito and kills him. But he tries to then tell Nicholson that he's British and he's like on his side. But Nicholson calls for help, and then Joyce's cover is blown.
Yeah, it's brutal. In the book, Shears is watching from across the river, and he sees Joyce obviously kill Saito, and then Nicholson calls for help, basically just blowing the whole gig. And in his mind, Shears is like, he killed the wrong one. When he came out of the bush, he should have killed Nicholson.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a strange choice to have this British officer almost forget that he's a prisoner. And he's just so proud of the bridge that they've built, because they built a beautiful bridge, I'm not gonna lie, that he doesn't want anything to happen to the bridge. And it's like, I don't understand why anyone would do that. But yeah, I guess that's the point of this character. We are not really supposed to understand his rigor in following the rules and being proper and kind of doing what is told. And pride. I think pride is it's a theme here that's it's not very obvious, but it's definitely a theme here that we're meant to pick up on.
Yeah. And if you're wondering if the book does a better job of elaborating why he's like that, it doesn't. Yeah, no, he's just but I will say the one thing the book does is it presents Nicholson's behavior in a positive light. Even Clipton, the voice of reason, is like, yeah, sometimes Nicholson makes me mad, but he's always doing the right thing. And like all the other characters always think that Nicholson is doing the right thing. So it's like a definitely an interesting authorial choice.
Well, to be frank, I did think he was doing the right thing in the beginning of the movie. Like, I felt like sticking to your principles is good. But then he just takes it way, way, way too far. Like, there's a point where it just crosses over in absolute stupidity.
Yeah, absolutely. So Joyce, who has just come running out of the bush and killed Saito, he ends up getting shot because of Nicholson, who calls for help and draws the attention of the rest of the Japanese. Shears attempts to swim the river to set off the detonator, but he also ends up getting killed. From the trees, Warden fires a mortar, which was kind of their backup plan. He wounds Nicholson. Nicholson falls on the detonator and blows up the bridge just as the train is crossing. And apparently they had to film the train crashing twice because they used a real train. And the first time the cameraman didn't get out of the way in time. So the director was like, well, we probably shouldn't set off the explosion because might not be good.
Man down.
Yeah, exactly. And Clipton witnesses all of these shenanigans. And, the movie kind of closes out with him declaring, madness. It's madness.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the book, the attack is actually a failure. They don't end up detonating the bridge. Nicholson prevents Joyce from detonating the explosives, and then Joyce, Nicholson, and Shears are all killed by Warden's mortar, which he does to prevent their capture. And then the book ends with Warden giving a report to a superior officer and saying that he's happy with all the decisions he made because, quote, it was really the only proper action I could have taken, end quote. So it kind of ties back in with, Nicholson, the rule follower, and like, well, you know what? In the end, everyone's a rule follower.
But it's so funny because even in the movie, Warden kind of apologizes for the murder, and he even says, "Well, if I didn't fire the mortar, then they would have been captured." So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the movie when he says that, to be honest, because he doesn't actually kill his own men. which is what he's trying to kind of say, that he had no choice but to have them killed, because otherwise it would be. It's so weird.
Yeah, choices were made. That's for sure.
And there's also one thing I don't like, and that is that they allow Nicholson to question what he's done at the very last moment. It's like, oh no, what have I done? And I think I would have liked it better if he didn't have that moment of regret, but that's just a personal preference.
Yeah. Yeah, because in the book, he never, like, up to the very end, he's convinced that he's doing the right thing. He never has that the second guessing, and he doesn't obviously fall on the detonator and blow the explosives. There is a sort of I can't remember if it's Warden or Shears, but one of the characters in the book goes and lays like sort of secondary backup plan explosives, and one of those ends up blowing. So the bridge doesn't blow up, but like the train gets derailed and stuff. So they sort of have like super, super, super minor success, I guess. But the whole thing is just like, what a foolish like loss of life for like nothing.
And then as the movie ends, we get, I don't remember what I called it when I sent you a message about it, but it's like parade music at the very end as everybody's dead. It's so funny.
It is funny. Yeah, this is definitely one of those movies where everyone dies, but then like somehow the ending is still like not that sad. You're like, okay, everyone died.
Yeah. And the people who survive, I guess, are Warden and the Thai ladies. The Thai ladies don't get hurt.
It's true. All the women survive, so that's good.
They do all. The only role they have is to carry the white man's stuff and to look at them like the sun shines out of their ass.
Absolutely. Yeah. The only reason we haven't named them is because they don't have names and they don't have dialogue except like one line.
But they are credited in the credits.
They are credited. They didn't credit Weaver, who has quite a lot of dialogue, but they did credit these 4 Thai ladies, so I suppose that's nice.
Yeah. You must have some notes. Tell me your notes.
I do have some notes. Yeah. Yeah. So Pierre Boulle, who wrote the book, he sort of loosely based it on his experiences. He was a French engineer. He had trained as a saboteur in Malaya when the war began, but he ended up getting imprisoned actually by his own side, sort of. He got imprisoned by the Vichy French, and he ended up spending 3.5 years as a POW, but he never worked on the Burma Railway. So it's sort of based on his experience as a POW, but the railway stuff is based on just stuff that he heard from other people, essentially. So yeah, not super historically accurate, I gather, but it has its its moments.
But he must have really hated his experience in the POW camp for him to be so incredibly racist towards the Japanese and the Thais and literally everybody else.
Yeah. And I think a big chunk of the war in the Pacific and that area as well was colonial powers fighting over colonies. You know, it was like the Japanese taking over places that had been formerly owned by the British and the Dutch and all of these Western powers. And you definitely get the vibes that this guy was very like, yeah, I think that France should own all of these places, and these people are not as good as us, and that
they're just less than us in every single way.
He's like, why would we let the Japanese take over this country? We were running it perfectly, you know.
It's ours, my precious.
Yeah. With regard to the railway itself, the Japanese needed the railway as a supply line because they were fighting the Allies in Burma, which is today Myanmar. It ran 420 kilometers through the jungle, and they had thought about building this railway before, but it was a huge slog. It was a massive undertaking, and they didn't really have the manpower to spare. But then they ended up having a huge amount of POWs that they had to feed and house anyway. So they thought, we'll get these 60,000 Allied POWs to build this railway. They also used more than 200,000 Asian laborers. So these would have been people who didn't really have a choice in the matter, who sort of got pressed into it by the Japanese. And by the time the railway was completed, around 13,000 Allied prisoners and at least 80,000 Asian laborers had died.
That's a lot. Holy crap.
Yeah, it was a really tough job, you know, hacking through the jungle. Obviously, if you're in the jungle, people were getting like beriberi, people were getting cholera, people were getting, you know, all these illnesses that you wouldn't have been susceptible to otherwise. If you work all day in the heat and you don't have enough food and water, you know, people were dying of all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, I enjoy in a cruel way. I enjoy when Shears lists all the things they can die of in the very beginning of the movie. It's like a long list of horrible diseases.
Yeah. Man, this is like just sort of an aside, but everyone in this movie is very like 1950s man looking. Like they're very like nowadays you would see like, if a dude was going to have his shirt off for a whole movie, he would look like Hugh Jackman. But these guys, they weren't doing that. They're like very slightly dad bod-ish. They're like obviously like strong and healthy, but there's like they got a little thickness on them. And it just cracks me up because it's like you see photos of the guys who like worked on this railway and they got so little food every day that they were just like, you can like count their ribs. Like they were so thin. And in this movie, they're like, no, everyone's greasy and thick and tanned and like they all look great.
And if it were made today, I think you'd get like method actors and they'd starve themselves for 3 months just for the role.
Yeah, definitely not suggesting that should have happened, but it just cracks me up a little bit.
No, me too. And then there's a bit where they're like covered in mud to try and not be seen when they're in the river. Like, who's who again? I can't see who's who in this.
Yeah, classic. All these white guys look the same. The real Saito, and because there was a real Saito, and the man upon which Nicholson is super, super, super loosely based, was Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toucey, and they became friends after the war. Toucey actually spoke in defense of Saito at his war crimes trial. You can watch Toucey's granddaughter talk about him on YouTube, and I super recommend it. She's a great orator. It's called The Colonel of Tamarkan, Philip Toucey, and the Bridge on the River Kwai. It's about 45 minutes, and she talks all about her dad's experience during the war, basically. And he was captured at the fall of Singapore. He was sent to work on the Burma Railway with 650 men under his command. There ended up being 2,500 men under his charge as when he got there and they started work. General Arthur Percival in Singapore had already agreed that all the men would be used for labor in this way. So there wasn't this, like, he didn't have a whole thing where he was like, the officers are not going to work. Like, that was not, the real life guy was not about that. And the real Toucey actually saw the film and said that he could never have confronted the Japanese and made them lose face like that. Like, he was like, yeah, none of this could have happened or would have happened. He also had his officers eat and sleep alongside the enlisted men. So he was not a guy who was all about, the division of labor. And it turned out when they spoke with Boulle about it, he actually based Nicholson's personality and behavior on some French officers he knew who had collaborated with the Japanese. So really, he created the Nicholson guy that is, I guess, sort of based on Toucey because Toucey was the real life guy who commanded the men who built this bridge. But in all the ways that matter, he's not really based on that guy.
Yeah, it seems to me that Toucey had a lot more respect for the Japanese, and especially for the commander, obviously. But the respect is nowhere. Well, I guess Nicholson does respect Saito in the movie, but not really what he stands for. But yeah. It's interesting. I'll put the documentary or the interview on our website.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a watch. Yeah, it's interesting that they, Boulle made that choice when he wrote the book. But yeah, so the real bridge in the novel and film actually crossed a river called the Mekong, which ran parallel to the Kwai Noi River, but did not intersect with it. And I guess what had happened was Boulle took a quick glance at a map and he's like, yeah, that sounds right. And then he just wrote a whole book about like a bridge that didn't actually cross the River Kwai. But the section of river where the bridge is was actually renamed the Kwai Yai in the 1960s after the movie came out. And in 1943, when the POWs were working on the bridge, there were actually 2 bridges built. So they built like a temporary wooden one to start with, and then they worked on a permanent steel and concrete one. Both of them ended up being destroyed by Allied bombing in the summer of 1945. So obviously this whole subplot about the bridge getting bombed by commandos didn't happen in real life. And the steel bridge was actually repaired, though, and it still stands today. And apparently it's a real tourist attraction. Like, you can go and look at it, and people do.
That's cool. It's funny that they renamed the section where the bridge is after the movie came out.
Yeah, right?
That's smart. Like, from a tourism perspective, that's really smart. We still need to rate this movie, and we're rating it days in the oven out of 10, and I'll start us off. I would rate this movie 7 days in the oven out of 10, because I did enjoy my time. I thought it could have been maybe slightly shorter in the beginning, but, it's a movie from the 50s, so what am I going to complain about? I like the use of music. I liked the acting for the most part. I didn't like that there weren't that many women in there with lines, but I guess I'm not too mad about it for this particular plot. And yeah, I enjoyed it. Don't think I would watch it again very soon. But yeah, overall good experience. How about you?
Yeah, I'm gonna give it 7.5 days in the oven out of 10. I also thought the acting was good. I thought Saito in particular was really good. Part of my issue with the book, obviously, was the fact that it was just so blatantly racist, and I felt that they actually gave Saito a chance to be a real character and like have a little bit of depth and nuance. So that was nice. I agree. Not enough women with lines, as per usual. A perennial issue we have with war media. But yeah, I also thought it was a bit long. I definitely got vibes of like in the 50s and 60s, they like to make a historical epic. So they're like, well, it has to be 3 hours long, whatever. But yeah, I had a good time for a movie where everyone dies at the end. I was glad that we did watch this because I was at trivia one time and I always want there to be a World War II question. And there was a World War II question and it was about this. And it was like, oh, what country is the bridge on the River Kwai? And I guessed the wrong country because I had never seen this movie. So now I've seen it. And now I know that they didn't even build a bridge over the River Kwai. So what can you say? But yeah, it was decent. I thought it was pretty good.
I'm kind of sad for you that you will never get that particular question again.
Right? I know. I'll just have the knowledge in my mind for nothing, I guess.
Yep. Useless.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, no, I enjoyed that for sure. And I also enjoyed talking about it. I don't think there's loads to talk about, but that's also because it was made at the time that it was made in, and also didn't really happen this way at all. So what are we really going to talk about? So, yeah, not bad. Are you reading anything?
I am. I'm reading a book called Shadowlands, A Journey Through Britain's Lost Cities and Vanished Villages by Matthew Green. And it's nonfiction, obviously, and it's about cities and towns that existed mostly during the medieval era that don't exist anymore for various reasons.
Ooh, it sounds kind of ghosty and fun. I mean, it's not ghosty, but it could be.
Well, it is kind of ghosty because these are places where, like, people lived and loved and worked and died and they're not there anymore. And sometimes there's trace evidence of them and sometimes there's not.
Interesting. I'm also reading. I'm reading. Can you believe it? I am reading 2 books at the same time again. Well, actually 3, but I'm only going to mention 2 because they're relevant. So I'm rereading The Freedom Line by Paul Eisner about the Combat Line because we have an episode coming up about it. Or related to it anyway. And I'm reading a book called Mission France, which is about the women of the SOE. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that sounds really good.
Yeah. It was only like 200 something pages, so I was really excited to get it like a tiny book. But then I opened it, and the pages are really thin, and the letters are tiny.
So it's basically not a short book.
It's not short, no. But it's easy to read, and it's really fun because it has names that we know, because Violet Zabo's in there, and stuff like that.
The pod, Violet Zabo.
Yes, so I'm excited about that, and hopefully I'll finish it, because I still haven't finished A Ring and a Prayer. So it's like an endless love affair with that book.
You'll finish it at some point.
Yeah.
You can follow us wherever you get your podcasts and rate us 5 stars. Send an episode to a friend. Send an episode to 10 friends. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. And you can go to our website, www.rosieTheReviewer.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next week.
Bye-bye.